The Charleston wedding reception was everything Melissa had dreamed of. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over 200 guests, roses cascaded from every table, and champagne flowed like water. My daughter looked radiant in her ivory gown, finally happy again after her bitter divorce 3 years ago. But something was wrong. 7-year-old Daniel sat beside me, his small hand gripping mine so tightly his knuckles had turned white. The boy who usually bounced in his chair during any celebration now sat frozen, his wide eyes fixed on something beneath the head table where his mother and new stepfather sat. "Danny, sweetie, what's wrong?" I whispered, leaning down to his level. The band played a soft waltz, but I could barely hear it over the thundering of my heart. He looked up at me with those knowing brown eyes, too old for his face. "Grandma," he gasped, his voice barely audible above the laughter and clinking glasses. "I want to go home now." My chest tightened. This wasn't the restless fidgeting of a bored child. This was fear. "What happened, baby? Tell Grandma." Daniel's grip on my hand grew stronger as he pointed a trembling finger toward the elaborate head table where Richard sat, arm draped possessively around Melissa's shoulders. "Haven't you looked under the table?" The words hit me like ice water. I followed his gaze to the pristine white tablecloth that swept to the floor, hiding everything beneath. The elegant centerpiece of white orchids and baby's breath suddenly looked sinister in the soft lighting. "Under the table?" I repeated, my voice catching. "What did you see, sweetheart?" But before Daniel could answer, Richard's booming laugh echoed across the room. My son-in-law raised his champagne glass, commanding attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I may have your attention." The room fell silent. Melissa beamed up at her new husband, completely unaware that something dark was lurking just feet away from where she sat. Daniel pressed closer to me, his small body trembling. "Grandma, please. Something's wrong. Really, really wrong." I stared at that tablecloth, my mind racing. What could a 7-year-old have seen that grown adults had missed? What was hiding in plain sight at my daughter's perfect wedding? The applause erupted around us as Richard finished his toast, but all I could hear was Daniel's whispered words echoing in my head. "Haven't you looked under the table?" I had to know. I waited until the crowd's attention shifted to the cake-cutting ceremony. The photographer's flash illuminated Melissa and Richard's smiling faces as they posed with the ornate 3-tier cake, their hands joined on the silver knife. "Stay right here, Danny," I whispered to my grandson, kissing the top of his head. "Grandma will be right back." My legs felt unsteady as I rose from my chair, smoothing down my navy dress. I had to look calm, composed, just another wedding guest taking a leisurely stroll around the reception hall. But my heart hammered against my ribs as I made my way toward the head table. I circled around behind the band, pretending to admire the floral arrangements while keeping my eyes on the tablecloth. The ivory fabric pooled elegantly on the polished floor, hiding whatever had frightened Daniel so badly. When I was sure no one was watching, I dropped my clutch near the table and crouched down, pretending to retrieve it. That's when I saw it. A thick black envelope, taped to the underside of the table with silver duct tape. It was bulky, stuffed with papers, and positioned exactly where Daniel would have spotted it when he'd crawled under earlier to retrieve his dropped crayon. My hands shook as I worked the tape free, the adhesive making soft ripping sounds that seemed deafening in my ears. The envelope was heavy, ominous in my palm. I glanced up. Richard was feeding Melissa cake, both of them laughing as frosting smudged her lips. The crowd oohed and awed, phones capturing every moment. No one noticed the mother-in-law crouched by their table, stealing secrets from the shadows. I slipped the envelope into my clutch and stood, forcing myself to smile and clap along with the other guests. But inside, questions burned like fire. Who had taped this envelope here? Was it meant to be found? Or was someone hiding evidence in the last place anyone would look? I caught Daniel's eye across the room. He was watching me intently, his small face pale but determined. He gave me the slightest nod as if to say, "You found it too, didn't you, Grandma?" The weight of the envelope pressed against my hip as I walked back to my seat, each step feeling like I was walking toward a cliff. Whatever was in that envelope was about to change everything. I excused myself quietly, telling Daniel I'd be right back. The ladies' powder room was mercifully empty, all the guests still captivated by the reception festivities. I locked the door behind me and leaned against it, my breath coming in short gasps. The envelope felt like it was burning through my clutch. With trembling fingers, I tore it open. Papers spilled out onto the marble countertop, official documents, photographs, bank statements. My vision blurred as I tried to process what I was seeing. At the top of the pile was a marriage certificate. Current. Valid. But it wasn't for Melissa and Richard. It was for Richard Ellis, not Richard Hayes, and a woman named Catherine Morrison, dated just 2 years ago. The ceremony had taken place in Savannah, Georgia. My legs nearly gave out. Richard was already married. I grabbed the next document with shaking hands. Bank statements from Melissa's savings account, showing systematic withdrawals over the past 6 months. Large amounts. 50,000 here, 30,000 there. Money that should have been building her new life was disappearing into accounts I'd never heard of. Then came the photographs. Richard with the other woman, Catherine, at what looked like their wedding reception. Her in a white dress, him in the same charming smile he'd worn when he'd swept Melissa off her feet. They looked happy, established, real. But there was more. Photos of Richard with other women, different cities, different names. A pattern emerged that made my stomach turn. My daughter wasn't Richard's wife. She was his mark. The final document was a handwritten note in Richard's distinctive scrawl, "MJ liquidation complete by December. C expects payment by New Year. This one's bigger than Atlanta." The bathroom walls seemed to close in around me. My beautiful, trusting daughter had just married a con artist. A man who'd been systematically draining her accounts while planning his exit strategy. I gripped the marble countertop, fighting waves of nausea. How long had he been planning this? How many other women had there been? Outside, I could hear the band striking up another song, guests laughing and dancing. My daughter's wedding celebration continued in blissful ignorance while I held the evidence of her destruction in my hands. I had to do something. But what? Storm out there and destroy her wedding night in front of 200 people? She'd never forgive me. And worse, she might not believe me. I stared at my reflection in the powder room mirror. My face was pale, my hands still shaking as I carefully placed the documents back in the envelope. Think, Evelyn. Think. If I marched out there now and announced Richard's betrayal, Melissa would be humiliated in front of everyone she knew. She'd already been through one devastating divorce. The shame had nearly broken her. And knowing my daughter, she'd defend Richard. She'd convince herself there was some explanation, some misunderstanding. She was too deep in love to see the truth, even with evidence staring her in the face. But I couldn't let this continue. Every minute Richard stayed married to her was another minute he could drain her accounts, manipulate her, destroy her future. And what about little Daniel? What would happen to him when Richard's scheme finally collapsed? I pulled out my phone and texted Clara, "Meet me on the terrace. Now. Emergency." My younger daughter had always been the skeptical one. She'd questioned Richard from the beginning, asking pointed questions about his past that he'd deflected with charm and humor. If anyone would help me handle this delicately, it would be Clara. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what had to come next. We needed to be smart about this. Strategic. Richard had made one mistake. Underestimating a 7-year-old's curiosity and a grandmother's protective instincts. But we had the evidence now. We had the truth. I slipped the envelope back into my clutch and unlocked the bathroom door. The hallway was empty, most guests still in the main reception hall. I could hear Richard's voice over the microphone again, probably making another toast, playing the devoted husband. Not for much longer. I walked toward the terrace doors, my spine straight and my resolve hardening with each step. Richard had picked the wrong family to con. He'd targeted a woman whose mother would burn the world down to protect her children. Tonight, his perfect scheme was going to crumble. And it was going to be very, very public. Standing on that terrace, waiting for Clara, memories flooded back like a broken dam. 23 years ago, when my husband David died of a heart attack at 45, I thought my world had ended. Melissa was 13, Clara 11, and suddenly I was a single mother with 2 grieving daughters and a mountain of debt. The life insurance barely covered the funeral. David's construction business collapsed without him. I sold everything. My engagement ring, my grandmother's china, even David's tools that the girls might have wanted someday. I worked 3 jobs, cleaning offices at dawn, serving lunch at the diner, and bookkeeping for small businesses at night. I never dated again. Never even considered it. Every ounce of energy I had went into raising my girls right, making sure they had opportunities I'd never had. Melissa was my sensitive one, always seeking approval, always trying to fix broken things. Stray cats, wounded birds, troubled friends. She'd inherited David's big heart but also his blind trust in people. Clara was my fighter, sharp-eyed and skeptical, questioning everything. She'd inherited my survival instincts. I pushed them both toward college, working extra shifts to pay for textbooks and dormitory fees. When Melissa announced she was majoring in social work because she wanted to help people, I bit my tongue. Social workers didn't make much money, but my daughter's compassion was her greatest strength. Clara chose business, just like I'd hoped. She had the spine for it. I thought I'd done everything right. Raised them to be independent, strong, capable women who wouldn't need to depend on any man the way I'd depended on David. But standing there, clutching evidence of my daughter's betrayal, I realized I'd missed something crucial. I'd taught them to be independent, but I'd never taught them to recognize predators. Melissa's kindness, her desire to see the best in everyone, the very qualities that made her beautiful, had made her vulnerable. Richard had spotted that vulnerability from across a crowded church and decided to exploit it. The irony burned like acid. I'd spent decades protecting my daughters from the world, only to watch one of them walk straight into the arms of a man who saw her generous heart as an opportunity for profit. But he'd made one mistake. He'd underestimated the mother who'd raised her. Melissa's first marriage to Tom Bradley had been everything a mother could want for her daughter. Tom was steady, reliable, a high school math teacher who worshipped the ground Melissa walked on. They'd met in college, dated for 3 years, married in a simple ceremony at our local church. When Daniel was born, I thought my daughter had found her fairy tale. But fairy tales don't prepare you for real life. Tom's drinking started small. A beer after work, then 2, then a 6-pack. He never got violent, never raised his voice. He just disappeared. Emotionally, mentally, physically. He'd sit in his recliner after school, drinking and grading papers until he passed out. Melissa tried everything. Counseling, interventions, support groups. She made excuses for him, covered for him when he missed family events, protected Daniel from seeing his father stumbling around the house. For 5 years, she carried that marriage on her shoulders alone. The final straw came when Tom showed up drunk to Daniel's kindergarten graduation. My grandson's proud moment was ruined by his father weaving through the auditorium, slurring congratulations that made other parents whisper and stare. Melissa filed for divorce the next week. But the damage was done. She blamed herself for Tom's addiction, convinced she'd failed as a wife. The confident young woman I'd raised became anxious, second-guessing every decision. She worked double shifts at the community center to support herself and Daniel, too proud to ask for help, too hurt to trust her own judgment. The divorce settlement was a joke. Tom kept the house because his name was on the mortgage. Melissa got debt and a broken heart. She moved into a cramped apartment with Daniel, started therapy, and slowly began rebuilding. It took 2 years before she'd even consider dating again. Then Richard appeared. Looking back, I could see how perfectly he'd calculated his approach. He waited until she was finally happy again, finally believing she deserved love. He studied her vulnerabilities, her need to feel chosen, her fear of being abandoned, her determination to prove she could make a marriage work. He became everything Tom hadn't been: attentive, generous, present. He swept her off her feet with expensive dinners and weekend trips, convinced her she deserved to be spoiled. By the time I met him, Melissa was already talking about wedding dresses. She was so desperate to prove her first marriage's failure hadn't been her fault that she ignored every red flag Richard raised. Clara saw through Richard from day one. "Mom, something's off about this guy," she told me after that first Sunday dinner when Melissa brought Richard home. "He compliments everything: the food, the house, your hair, Melissa's dress, but it feels like he's reading from a script." I'd noticed it too. Richard's charm was too smooth, too practiced. When I'd asked about his family, he'd given vague answers about growing up down south and parents who'd passed years ago. No siblings, no childhood friends, no stories that painted a real picture of his past. But Melissa was glowing, happier than I'd seen her since before Tom's drinking started. When Clara voiced her concerns, Melissa got defensive. "You're being paranoid," Melissa had snapped during one family dinner. "Just because you've never been in love doesn't mean you get to tear apart my relationship." Clara had flinched like she'd been slapped, but she didn't back down. "I'm not tearing it apart. I'm asking legitimate questions. Where did he work before moving here? Why are there no photos of him online before last year? Why does he pay for everything in cash? Maybe because he's successful and generous, unlike some people I know," Melissa had shot back. "That fight had created a rift between my daughters that lasted months." Clara stopped coming to family dinners when Richard was there. Melissa interpreted this as jealousy, but I knew better. Clara was protecting herself from having to watch our family be manipulated. The few times Clara tried to raise concerns with me privately, I'd made the mistake of staying neutral. "Your sister's an adult," I'd said. "She has to make her own choices." But Clara kept digging. She'd tried running background checks, searching social media, even driving by Richard's apartment building to see what kind of car he drove. Every instinct she had was screaming danger, but without concrete proof, she just looked like the bitter sister trying to sabotage Melissa's happiness. "Promise me you'll keep your eyes open, Mom," Clara had begged me 2 weeks before the wedding. "If something feels wrong, trust that feeling. Don't let him hurt her the way Tom did." Now, standing on this terrace with evidence of Richard's betrayal burning in my purse, I realized Clara had been right about everything. My younger daughter had seen the predator in our midst, and we'd all dismissed her warnings as sibling rivalry. I owed her an apology, and a chance to help me fix this. The first time I met Richard Hayes was at Sunday service 11 months ago. He'd walked into our small Baptist church like he owned the place, wearing a tailored navy suit that probably cost more than I made in a month. His salt and pepper hair was perfectly styled, his smile bright and confident as he shook hands with everyone in sight. "You must be Evelyn," he'd said when Melissa introduced us, taking my hand in both of his. "Melissa talks about you constantly. I can see where she gets her beauty." It should have been a compliment, but something about the way his eyes assessed me made my skin crawl. Like he was cataloging my weaknesses, filing away information for later use. During the service, I watched him. He sang every hymn perfectly, knew when to stand and sit, dropped $100 bill into the collection plate with a flourish that made sure people noticed. Pastor Williams practically glowed when Richard complimented his sermon afterward. But I caught him checking his expensive watch during the prayers. "He's wonderful, isn't he?" Melissa had gushed during lunch. "So different from Tom. He actually listens when I talk, remembers little things, makes me feel special." And he did. Richard sent flowers to Melissa's work for no reason, surprised her with weekend trips to Savannah and Charleston, bought Daniel expensive toys that made the boy's eyes light up. He remembered birthdays, anniversaries, even the date of David's death. When Melissa mentioned wanting to go back to school for her master's degree, Richard immediately offered to pay for it. He was everything Tom hadn't been: present, generous, attentive. Too attentive. I started noticing how he steered conversations away from his past, how he deflected personal questions with jokes or compliments. When I asked about his work, something vague about business consulting, he'd change the subject to Melissa's job, praising her dedication to helping troubled families. He studied us, learned our patterns, our weaknesses, our dreams. He became exactly what each of us needed him to be. For Melissa, he was the devoted partner who valued her opinions. For Daniel, he was the fun stepfather figure who never disciplined or demanded. For the church congregation, he was the successful businessman who tithed generously. For me, he was the respectful son-in-law who asked for my blessing before proposing. Now I understood why his performance had felt so perfect. He'd done this before. It was a crisp October morning when everything changed. I was sitting in my usual pew, third row from the front, right side, listening to Pastor Williams preach about forgiveness when the church doors opened with a soft creak. A stranger walked in. He moved with quiet confidence, scanning the sanctuary until his eyes found Melissa 2 rows ahead of me. She turned, her face lighting up like Christmas morning, and gestured for him to join her. Richard Hayes was handsome in that dangerous way that makes smart women stupid. Tall, broad-shouldered, with silver threading through dark hair and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. His suit was expensive. I'd cleaned enough offices in my day to recognize quality fabric when I saw it. But it was his smile that set off alarm bells. Too practiced. Too perfect. After service, Melissa practically bounced over to introduce us. "Mom, this is Richard. Richard, this is my mother, Evelyn Johnson." He took my hand in both of his, holding it just a beat too long. "Mrs. Johnson, I've heard so much about you. Melissa says you're the strongest woman she knows." The compliment should have warmed me, but something about the way he said it felt calculated. Like he'd studied what to say to win over skeptical mothers. "How did you two meet?" I asked, my voice carefully neutral. At the community center, Melissa jumped in before Richard could answer. He was volunteering with the literacy program. "Isn't that wonderful?" I watched Richard's face. For just a split second, something flickered in his expression. Surprise? Annoyance? Before that perfect smile returned. "I believe in giving back to the community," he said smoothly. "Especially when it's filled with such dedicated people like your daughter." Pastor Williams approached then, extending his hand to Richard with the enthusiasm he reserved for potential new members, especially ones who looked like they could afford generous donations. "Welcome to First Baptist, son. I don't believe we've met." "Richard Hayes," he replied, his handshake firm and brief. "I've been looking for a church home. This feels like exactly what I've been searching for." The pastor beamed. "Well, we'd love to have you join our church family. What line of work are you in?" "Business consulting," Richard answered vaguely. "I help companies reorganize their assets." Even then, that answer had felt rehearsed. Too smooth. Too empty of actual information. But Melissa was glowing, hanging on his every word, and I found myself wanting to believe in her happiness. I should have trusted my instincts instead. Over the following months, Richard became a fixture at family dinners, church services, and holiday gatherings. He was always charming, always generous, always saying exactly the right thing at exactly the right moment. That was the problem. Real people fumble sometimes. They tell boring stories, have awkward moments, forget names. Richard never did any of those things. He was like a walking greeting card, perfect on the surface, but hollow underneath. When I asked about his childhood, he'd smile sadly and say, "I prefer to focus on the future, Mrs. Johnson. The past is behind us for a reason." When Clara questioned where he'd lived before Charleston, he'd deflect with humor, "Oh, you know how it is in consulting. Here 1 month, there the next. Home is wherever the heart is, right?" When Daniel innocently asked why Richard didn't have any pictures on his phone of his family, Richard had ruffled the boy's hair and said, "Some families aren't worth remembering, buddy. That's why I'm so grateful for yours." It should have been touching. Instead, it felt like performance art. The red flags were subtle, the kind that make you question your own judgment. He paid for everything in cash, claiming he preferred the simplicity. His apartment was furnished like a hotel room, expensive but impersonal, no family photos, no childhood keepsakes, nothing that revealed who he really was. When Melissa mentioned wanting to meet his friends, he'd explain that his work kept him so busy he'd lost touch with most people. Besides, he'd say, pulling her close, "Why would I need anyone else when I have you?" It was romantic enough to make Melissa melt and vague enough to avoid scrutiny. The biggest red flag was how quickly he moved. Within 3 months of dating, he was talking about marriage. Within 6 months, he'd proposed. When I gently suggested they might want to take more time to get to know each other, Melissa bristled. "Mom, when you know, you know. Daddy proposed to you after 4 months, remember?" She was right. David had proposed quickly too. But David had also introduced me to his parents, his siblings, his college roommates. I'd seen his childhood bedroom, heard embarrassing stories from his mother, met his high school friends at our engagement party. Richard existed in a vacuum, with no past to verify and no connections to trace. But love makes people blind, and Melissa was desperately in love with the idea of being chosen by someone so seemingly perfect. It was a Thursday evening in March when I heard them fighting. I'd stopped by Melissa's apartment to drop off some of Daniel's school clothes I'd mended, using my spare key to let myself in quietly. I didn't want to interrupt their dinner, so I headed toward Daniel's room to leave the clothes on his bed. That's when I heard Richard's voice from the kitchen, sharper than I'd ever heard it before. "What do you mean, you can't access it right now? It's your money, Melissa." "The CD doesn't mature for another month," Melissa replied, her voice tight with stress. "I can't just withdraw it without penalties. You know that. This is a time-sensitive opportunity. My business partner needs the investment capital now, or we lose the deal entirely." I froze in the hallway, my heart sinking. Daniel was at soccer practice. I could hear the apartment's silence around their voices, confirming we were alone. "Richard, it's my son's college fund. I've been contributing to it for years. I can't just—" "I'm not asking you to give it away," Richard interrupted, his tone softening into that persuasive register I'd learned to hate. "It's an investment. A guaranteed return. We'll make back double what you put in within 6 months, and then Daniel's college will be completely paid for. You said the same thing about the house down payment money last month." Silence stretched between them. When Richard spoke again, his voice was cold. "Are you saying you don't trust me? Your own husband-to-be?" "That's not—" "Richard, please, I'm not saying that. It's just—" "Just what, Melissa? Just that you'd rather keep your money separate from our future together? Just that you don't believe in us enough to take a small risk?" I could hear the manipulation wrapping around her like chains. This was how predators worked. They made their victims feel guilty for having boundaries, selfish for protecting themselves. "I believe in us," Melissa said quietly. "You know I do." "Then prove it." I backed toward the front door, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the locks. I couldn't let them know I'd overheard, but I also couldn't stay and listen to him pressure my daughter into financial ruin. Outside in my car, I sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes, trying to decide what to do. Call Melissa? She'd deny there was a problem. Call Clara? She'd want to march upstairs and confront them both. Instead, I drove home and added financial manipulation to my growing list of concerns about Richard Hayes. Children see things adults miss because they haven't learned to ignore their instincts yet. Daniel started noticing Richard's inconsistencies around Christmas. It began with small observations that he'd share with me during our weekly baking sessions. "Grandma, Richard says he doesn't like chocolate, but I saw him eating Mom's brownies when she wasn't looking. Maybe he was just being polite, sweetheart. But why would you lie about not liking chocolate? That's silly." From Daniel's 7-year-old perspective, it was silly. Adults didn't usually lie about preferences unless they were trying to create a particular image. But a child's logic cut straight through the manipulation. A few weeks later, Richard told Mom he never learned to swim because his family was poor, but he has a picture on his phone of him on a boat. He's wearing swim trunks. I tried to dismiss Daniel's observations as misunderstandings, but they kept coming. He says he's from Georgia, but when that man at church talked about Atlanta, Richard didn't know what he was talking about. Richard told me he used to have a dog, but then he told Mom he was allergic to dogs. How can you be allergic to something you used to have? The most disturbing observation came in February, during one of our Sunday dinners. "Grandma," Daniel had whispered while Richard was in the bathroom, "sometimes Richard talks to himself in the mirror. He practices saying things to Mom. Different voices, like he's in a play." "What kind of things, baby?" "Like, 'Oh honey, you're so beautiful, and don't worry, everything will work out.' But his face doesn't match his words. His face looks angry." A chill had run down my spine. Daniel was describing someone rehearsing emotional manipulation, practicing sincerity like an actor preparing for a role. When I gently questioned Daniel about what else he'd noticed, the floodgates opened. Richard claimed to be lactose intolerant but drank milk when he thought no one was watching. He said he'd never been married but had a pale band of skin on his ring finger where a wedding band would sit. He told different stories about his childhood depending on who was listening. To adults, these might seem like minor inconsistencies. Everyone has small secrets or contradictions. But to Daniel, they were lies, plain and simple. "Why does Richard pretend to be different things?" he'd asked me once. I hadn't known how to answer then. Now I did. Because Richard wasn't a person. He was a performance designed to exploit my daughter's kindness. The final months before the wedding were a whirlwind of expensive preparations that should have been joyful but instead filled me with growing dread. Richard insisted on paying for everything: the venue, the flowers, the catering, even Melissa's dress. "My bride deserves the best," he'd say whenever Melissa tried to suggest more modest alternatives. But I noticed he never paid with credit cards or checks. Everything was cash, handed over in thick envelopes that made vendors' eyes widen. Who carried around $10,000 in cash for wedding deposits? The guest list grew larger by the week. Richard claimed to have business associates who wanted to attend, though he never introduced any of them beforehand. 200 people were expected, but I could only account for about 50 who actually knew either Melissa or our family. "Don't you think it's strange that we've never met any of Richard's friends?" I'd asked Melissa during a dress fitting. "He's a private person, Mom. Not everyone broadcasts their personal life like we do. But it wasn't just privacy, it was isolation. Richard had systematically separated Melissa from anyone who might ask difficult questions. Her college friends had grown apart from her. Her co-workers weren't invited because it would be awkward to mix business and personal life. Even some of our extended family had been cut from the list for various manufactured reasons. The venue itself was ostentatious, a historic mansion in Charleston with crystal chandeliers and marble floors. It was beautiful but impersonal, like everything else about Richard. During the final week, Daniel's behavior became increasingly anxious. He started having nightmares, clinging to me during visits, asking when everything would go back to normal. After the wedding, sweetheart, I'd assured him. Things will settle down after the wedding. But Daniel had shaken his head solemnly. No, Grandma. After the wedding, everything's going to be different. Bad different. The night before the ceremony, I'd lain awake staring at the ceiling, my grandmother's instincts screaming danger. Every red flag, every inconsistency, every manipulation I'd witnessed over the past year swirled through my mind like a tornado. But what could I do? Object during the ceremony? Beg Melissa to call it off based on feelings and a 7-year-old's observations? I'd prayed that night, really prayed, for wisdom, for protection, for some sign of what I should do. I never imagined the answer would come from Daniel, hiding under a reception table. Back on the terrace, the black envelope felt like it weighed 50 pounds in my clutch. The sounds of the reception drifted through the French doors, laughter, music, the clinking of champagne glasses, while I stood in the Charleston evening air, holding evidence of my daughter's destruction. The terrace was empty except for a few flickering lanterns and scattered cocktail tables. Spanish moss draped from ancient oak trees, creating shadows that seemed to whisper secrets in the humid breeze. I pulled out my phone to text Clara again, but before I could hit send, I heard the sharp click of heels on marble. Mom. Clara's voice cut through the darkness. She emerged from the reception hall, her emerald bridesmaid's dress flowing behind her as she hurried toward me. What's wrong? Your text scared me. One look at my face told her everything she needed to know. It's Richard, isn't it? She said, her voice dropping to a whisper. I knew it. I knew something was wrong with him. I glanced back toward the reception hall, making sure we were alone. Through the windows, I could see Melissa and Richard on the dance floor, swaying to a romantic ballad. Her white dress sparkled under the chandeliers, her face radiant with happiness. She had no idea her new husband was already married to someone else. Clara, I need you to stay calm, I began, but she was already shaking her head. How bad is it, Mom? What did you find? I hesitated. Once I showed her the contents of that envelope, there would be no going back. We'd cross a line from suspicion to knowledge, from concern to action. But watching Richard's hands on my daughter's waist, seeing him whisper something in her ear that made her laugh, I knew we were past the point of protection through ignorance. He's not who he says he is, I said quietly, pulling the envelope from my clutch. Clara's eyes widened as she saw the thick black package. Where did you get that? Daniel found it. Under the head table. Daniel found. Clara stopped, her face going pale in the lantern light. Mom, what's in there? I took a deep breath, feeling like I was about to detonate a bomb that would destroy my daughter's happiness, but might be the only way to save her future. Everything, I whispered. Evidence of everything. Clara reached for the envelope with trembling hands. Show me. Clara's hands shook as she opened the envelope, spilling the documents across a wrought iron table under the lantern light. I watched her face transform as she processed each piece of evidence, the marriage certificate, the bank statements, the photographs. Oh my God, she breathed, holding up the marriage license. He's already married. To Catherine Morrison. Mom, This is dated 2 years ago. Keep reading, I said quietly, my voice steady despite the storm raging in my chest. Clara's face went white as she studied the bank statements. These are Melissa's accounts. He's been draining them systematically. 50,000, 30,000. Jesus, Mom, he's stolen nearly $200,000 from her. The photographs were the final blow. Richard with different women, different settings, different names. A pattern of deception that stretched back years. He's done this before, Clara whispered, her voice hollow with realization. Multiple times. Look at these dates: Atlanta, Savannah, now Charleston. He moves from city to city, finds vulnerable women, marries them, takes their money, then disappears. I nodded, the weight of the truth settling over us like a shroud. The note says MJ liquidation complete by December. That's Melissa Johnson. Our Melissa is just another mark to him. Clara's hands clenched into fists, crumpling one of the photographs. That son of a bitch. That manipulative, lying son of a bitch. How long has he been planning this? Since the day he met her, I said. Maybe even before. He probably researched her. Divorced single mother, works in social services, has a heart too big for her own good. He knew exactly what he was hunting for. Through the French doors, we could see the reception continuing in blissful ignorance. Melissa was laughing at something Richard had whispered in her ear, completely unaware that her new husband was already planning his exit strategy. We have to stop this, Clara said, her voice fierce with protective rage. We have to expose him. I know, I replied. But how? If we cause a scene now, Melissa will be humiliated in front of 200 people. If we wait, he'll disappear with whatever's left of her money. Clara stood up abruptly, pacing to the edge of the terrace. There has to be a way to make him expose himself. To let Melissa see who he really is without destroying her in the process. I joined her at the railing, both of us staring at the man who had infiltrated our family with surgical precision. Maybe there is, I said slowly. But we need more evidence. We need to catch him in the act. As if summoned by our conversation, Richard suddenly excused himself from the dance floor. He kissed Melissa's cheek and headed toward the terrace doors, his phone already pressed to his ear. Clara and I ducked behind a large magnolia tree, our hearts pounding as Richard stepped outside. He walked to the far end of the terrace, thinking he was alone. I know, he said into the phone, his voice completely different from the charming tone we'd grown accustomed to. This voice was cold, calculating, impatient. The timeline got moved up. The old lady's getting suspicious. Clara gripped my arm, her nails digging into my skin. No, I can't wait another month, Richard continued, pacing like a caged animal. The Johnson account is almost empty anyway. I've got maybe 30,000 left to work with, and that's if she doesn't check her statements. My blood turned to ice. He was talking about my daughter like she was a bank account to be drained. Catherine, baby, listen to me. Once this reception is over, we'll have everything we need. I'll liquidate the remaining assets tomorrow, transfer the funds, and we'll be in Mexico by Thursday. Catherine. His real wife. The woman from the marriage certificate. Of course she signed the papers, Richard laughed, a sound devoid of warmth. She thinks it's a romantic gesture, adding me to all her accounts, making me beneficiary on her life insurance. She has no idea I can drain everything and disappear. Clara looked like she was going to be sick. I felt the same way. Don't worry about the family, Richard continued. The mother's a pushover, and the sisters all bark, no bite. By the time they figure out what happened, I'll be long gone. This is just like the Atlanta job, clean, simple, profitable. He paused, listening to something Catherine was saying. Yeah, I've got the copies of everything. Marriage certificate, financial documents, even some photos for insurance. If anyone comes looking, they'll find evidence that she willingly gave me access to everything. The bastard had covered his tracks. He'd created a paper trail that would make Melissa look complicit in her own financial destruction. "I love you too, baby," Richard finished, his voice softening with genuine affection. Affection he'd never shown my daughter. "See you Thursday. We'll celebrate on the beach." He hung up and headed back inside, his mask of devoted husband sliding seamlessly back into place. Clara and I stared at each other in horror. "We have him," she whispered. We sat in stunned silence for several minutes, the weight of what we'd overheard settling over us like a death sentence. Richard wasn't just stealing from Melissa. He was planning to disappear entirely, leaving her financially ruined and emotionally destroyed. "Mexico by Thursday," Clara repeated numbly. 3 days from now. "The remaining assets," I added. "He's not finished bleeding her dry." Through the terrace windows, I watched my daughter dancing with her new husband, radiant in her white gown, completely unaware that the man holding her was already planning his escape route. The mother in me wanted to protect her from this pain, to find some way to fix this quietly, privately, without shattering her heart in front of 200 witnesses. But the realist in me knew better. There was no gentle way to expose a predator. "We could call the police," Clara suggested, but even as she said it, I could hear the doubt in her voice. "And tell them what? That we overheard a phone conversation? That we found documents taped under a table?" I shook my head. "He's covered his tracks. Everything he's done is technically legal. She gave him access to her accounts willingly. By the time the authorities untangle this mess, he'll be long gone." Clara's jaw tightened. "So what do we do? Let him destroy her?" "No," I said, my voice growing stronger with resolve. "We expose him. Here. Tonight. In front of everyone. Mom, that will humiliate her." "Not as much as waking up in 3 days to find her bank accounts empty and her husband vanished," I interrupted. "At least this way, she'll know the truth. She'll know it wasn't her fault, that she didn't fail at another marriage. She was targeted by a professional con artist." I stood up, smoothing down my dress, feeling 20 years of motherhood crystallizing into purpose. "Your sister is about to lose everything to a man who sees her as nothing more than a paycheck. I won't let that happen. I don't care if she hates me for the rest of her life. I won't stand by and watch him destroy her." Clara rose beside me, her face set with determination. "What do you need me to do?" "Stay close," I said, tucking the envelope back into my clutch. "When I make my move, be ready to back me up. This is going to get ugly." We walked back toward the reception hall, 2 women armed with truth and fury, ready to wage war for the daughter and sister we loved. Richard was about to learn that he'd made one fatal miscalculation. He'd underestimated a mother's love. "Know what?" he said, forcing that practiced smile back onto his face. "Melissa, sweetheart, whatever your mother has told you, whatever lies she's concocted because she can't bear to see you happy." Lies. Melissa's voice was barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of a woman finally seeing clearly. She held up the marriage certificate with shaking hands. "Is this a lie, Richard? Is Catherine Morrison a lie?" His face went white, but he recovered quickly. "I can explain that. It's complicated, but..." "Complicated." Clara stepped forward, her phone in her hand. "Like your phone call 20 minutes ago? The one where you told Catherine you'd be in Mexico by Thursday with all of Melissa's money." Richard's mask didn't just slip, it shattered completely. The charming smile vanished, replaced by cold calculation. "You were spying on me? Recording my private conversations?" "Recording evidence of fraud," Clara shot back. "Recording proof that you're a con artist who's been bleeding my sister dry for months." Melissa, don't listen to them, Richard said, his voice taking on that manipulative tone I'd learned to recognize. They're jealous. They can't stand that you found happiness without them. This is exactly what toxic families do, they sabotage. Stop. Melissa's voice cut through his manipulation like a blade. She stood slowly, the wedding dress that had made her look like a princess now seeming like a costume in a cruel play. Just stop talking. But Richard couldn't stop. Cornered predators never could. Baby, listen to me. Whatever they think they found, there's an explanation. I love you. I married you because I love you. These documents, this phone call, it's all taken out of context. You know me, Melissa. You know my heart. Do I? She asked quietly. Because according to these bank statements, you've stolen nearly $200,000 from me. According to this marriage certificate, you're already married to someone else. According to my sister's recording, you're planning to disappear in 3 days. I can explain all of that. Then explain, she said, her voice growing stronger. Explain Catherine Morrison. Explain the money. Explain why my son knew something was wrong before any of the adults did. Richard looked around the room like a trapped animal, his eyes wild with panic and rage. This wasn't going according to his script, and for the first time in months, he had no charming words to deflect the truth. You want the truth? He snarled, his mask finally falling away completely. Fine. You were easy, Melissa. Desperate, naive, and easy. The words hung in the air like poison. Melissa flinched as if she'd been physically struck, but Clara was already moving, her phone held high. Say that again, Clara demanded, her finger hovering over the record button. Tell everyone how easy my sister was. You think you're so smart, Richard sneered, his true personality finally emerging. Cold, calculating, cruel. But you're too late. The money's already gone. The accounts are already emptied. You can expose me all you want, but Melissa will still be broke. Not if you're arrested for fraud, I said, stepping closer to him. Not if the police freeze your accounts before you can transfer anything to Mexico. Richard laughed, a sound devoid of any warmth. Arrested for what? She gave me access to everything willingly. Every transfer, every withdrawal, every investment, all legal. All consensual. Good luck proving otherwise. But Clara was smiling now, holding her phone steady. You mean like this withdrawal? The one you made this morning without telling her? She showed him the screen, a banking app displaying Melissa's account activity. A $30,000 transfer made just hours before the wedding ceremony. How did you? Richard started, then stopped, realizing he was incriminating himself. I helped Melissa set up mobile banking last month, Clara said smugly. She gave me access in case of emergencies. Funny thing about emergency access, it shows real-time transactions. The blood drained from Richard's face. That transfer was for wedding expenses. To an account in the Cayman Islands? Clara raised an eyebrow. What kind of wedding expenses require offshore banking? Richard's composure completely collapsed. You meddling bitch. This was none of your business. My sister's well-being is always my business, Clara shot back. Just like it's my business to make sure every guest at this reception knows exactly who they're celebrating. She turned toward the door, where curious wedding guests had begun to gather, drawn by the raised voices and commotion. Phones were already out, recording everything. Should I tell them? Clara called out loud enough for the growing crowd to hear. Or would you like to explain to everyone how you're already married to another woman? How you've been systematically stealing from your new bride. How you planned to disappear to Mexico by Thursday. Richard's face twisted with rage and desperation. You can't prove any of that. Clara held up her phone again. Actually, I can. Want to hear the recording of your phone call with Catherine? The one where you called Melissa, just another job? The gasps from the doorway told us the guests had heard every word. I waited until the perfect moment, when Richard was making another toast, commanding the attention of every guest in the room. He stood at the head table, champagne glass raised, his voice booming with practiced sincerity. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you all for being here tonight to celebrate the beginning of my life with the most beautiful, generous woman I've ever known. The crowd awed, phones capturing every moment of what they thought was romantic devotion. Melissa beamed up at her new husband, her eyes shining with tears of joy. I couldn't wait another second. Melissa, I called out, my voice cutting through Richard's speech like a blade. The room fell silent, 200 faces turning toward me as I stood at the back of the reception hall. I need to speak with you. Right now. The silence was deafening. Melissa's face flushed with embarrassment, her eyes darting between me and Richard. Mom, this isn't the time. Yes, it is, I said firmly, walking toward the head table with purposeful steps. Every eye in the room followed me, whispers beginning to ripple through the crowd. This can't wait. Richard's mask slipped for just a moment. I caught a flash of panic in his eyes before that charming smile returned. Mrs. Johnson, surely whatever this is about can wait until... No, I said, my voice echoing in the suddenly quiet ballroom. It cannot wait until Thursday. I saw him flinch at the specific date, and I knew he understood exactly what I meant. Melissa, please, I continued, never taking my eyes off Richard's face. Trust me. Come with me now. The room buzzed with confused murmurs. Guests pulled out their phones, sensing drama. This was exactly what I'd wanted to avoid, but it was also the only way to save my daughter. Melissa stood slowly, her face a mixture of embarrassment and anger. Mother, you're ruining my wedding. I'm saving your life, I said quietly, but loud enough for the microphone to pick up. And if you come with me right now, you'll understand why. Richard stepped forward, his hand reaching for Melissa's arm. Darling, you don't have to. Don't touch her, Clara's voice rang out from beside me. My younger daughter had moved to flank Richard, her eyes blazing with protective fury. Don't you dare touch her. The standoff stretched for an eternal moment, the entire reception hall holding its breath. Finally, Melissa nodded slowly. Okay, she whispered. Okay, Mom. But this better be important. It's the most important thing I'll ever tell you, I promised. We moved to a small antechamber off the main reception hall, private but not completely isolated. Clara positioned herself by the door while I guided Melissa to a velvet settee, my hands trembling as I pulled out the black envelope. Mom, what is this about? Melissa's voice was tight with stress and anger. You just humiliated me in front of everyone we know. I know, I said, kneeling beside her. And I'm sorry. But Melissa, baby, I need you to look at these documents. Really look at them. I handed her the marriage certificate first. She took it with shaking hands, her eyes scanning the official seal, the signatures, the date. I don't understand, she said slowly. This says Richard Ellis is married to someone named Catherine Morrison. But Richard's name is Hayes, and he's married to me. Keep reading, I whispered, handing her the bank statements. Her face went white as she recognized her account numbers, saw the systematic withdrawals, the dates that corresponded with Richard's business trips and investment opportunities. These are my accounts, she said, her voice barely audible. But I didn't authorize these transfers. I never, she stopped, remembering. The investment opportunities. He said they were time-sensitive, that I needed to trust him. I showed her the photographs next, Richard with other women, other names, other cities. The pattern was undeniable. He's done this before, I said gently. Multiple times. You weren't the first, sweetheart. You were just the most recent. Melissa's hands shook as she sorted through the evidence, her world crumbling with each document. How long have you known? I found these tonight. Under the head table. Daniel saw them first. That's why he wanted to leave. Daniel knew. Her voice cracked. My 7-year-old son knew my marriage was a lie. The pain in her eyes was unbearable, but I pressed on. There's more. Clara and I overheard him on the phone tonight. He's planning to disappear Thursday. To Mexico. With his real wife. Melissa doubled over as if I'd punched her in the stomach. Thursday? That's 3 days from now. He was never going to stay, I said, kneeling beside her and taking her hands. This was always the plan. Meet you, marry you, drain your accounts, disappear. You were a job to him, nothing more. Tears streamed down her face, ruining her perfect makeup. I thought he loved me. I thought finally someone loved me. He doesn't know how to love, Clara said fiercely from the doorway. But we do. And that's why we're going to make sure he pays for this. The antechamber door burst open with such force it slammed against the wall. Richard stood in the doorway, his perfect composure finally cracking. His bow tie was loosened, his hair disheveled, and something wild and dangerous flickered in his eyes. What the hell is going on here? He demanded, his voice no longer smooth and charming but sharp with desperation. Melissa, what are you doing? Our guests are waiting. I stepped protectively in front of my daughter, who was still clutching the damning documents. She knows, Richard. We all know. His eyes darted to the papers in Melissa's hands, and I saw the exact moment he realized his carefully constructed world was collapsing. But instead of confessing, instead of showing even a shred of remorse, he doubled down. The antechamber had become a fishbowl, with wedding guests pressed against the doorway like spectators at a car accident. Their shocked faces were illuminated by the glow of phone screens as everyone scrambled to capture the drama unfolding before them. Oh my God, is that true? I heard someone whisper. He's already married to someone else? Did she say he stole her money? The whispers spread like wildfire through the crowd, phones recording everything as Richard's perfect wedding facade crumbled in real time. This was exactly what I'd wanted to avoid. My daughter's humiliation broadcast to everyone we knew, but it was also the only way to ensure Richard couldn't manipulate his way out of this. Ladies and gentlemen, Richard said, attempting to regain control, his voice carrying that familiar practiced charm. There's been a terrible misunderstanding. Play the recording, someone called out from the crowd. Let us hear it. Clara didn't hesitate. She turned up the volume on her phone, and Richard's voice filled the room, cold, calculating, completely different from the charming man they all thought they knew. The Johnson account is almost empty anyway. I've got maybe 30,000 left to work with. Once this reception is over, we'll have everything we need. By the time they figure out what happened, I'll be long gone. The reaction was immediate and devastating. Gasps, curses, the sound of phones capturing every moment. Pastor Williams, who had performed the ceremony just hours earlier, looked physically ill. You son of a bitch, someone shouted from the back of the crowd. Call the police, another voice demanded. Richard's face cycled through panic, rage, and desperation as he realized his carefully constructed persona was disintegrating in front of 200 witnesses. These weren't just strangers. These were people from our community, our church, Melissa's workplace. His reputation, his ability to move to another city and start fresh, was being destroyed in real time. This is all taken out of context, he said, but his voice cracked with desperation. Private conversations twisted too. Context. Melissa's voice cut through the noise like a blade. She stood slowly, the wedding dress that had made her radiant now looking like a tragic costume. What context makes it okay to steal from your wife? What context makes bigamy acceptable? The crowd fell silent, waiting for her next words. My daughter, who had been victimized and humiliated, was finally finding her voice. "You're right about one thing, Richard," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I was easy. Easy to love, easy to trust, easy to believe in happily ever after." She stepped toward him, her spine straightening. "But you made one mistake. You underestimated my family." Richard's eyes darted around the room like a cornered animal, searching for an escape route. The crowd of wedding guests blocked the main entrance, their phones still recording, their faces showing a mixture of shock, disgust, and morbid fascination. "This is insane," he said, his voice rising with desperation. "You people are acting like I'm some kind of criminal." "Because you are a criminal," Clara said firmly. "Fraud, bigamy, theft. Should I keep going?" Richard made his move then, pushing past the crowd toward the exit. But he'd forgotten about the venue's security team, professional men who'd been hired to handle exactly these kinds of disruptions at high-end events. "Sir, I'm going to need you to stay put," the head security guard said calmly, stepping into Richard's path. "Get out of my way," Richard snarled, all pretense of civility gone. "I'm leaving." "No, you're not." The security guard's hand rested casually on his radio. "We've already called the police. They're on their way." The color drained from Richard's face. "You can't detain me. I haven't done anything illegal." "Fraud is illegal," I said, stepping forward with the documents still in my hand. "So is bigamy. So is theft. She gave me access to those accounts." Richard shouted, pointing at Melissa. "Everything I did was legal." "Was lying about your identity legal?" Clara asked. "Was marrying my sister while you're already married to Catherine Morrison legal?" The crowd murmured their shock again. Some guests had started leaving, unable to stomach the drama. Others remained, transfixed by the destruction of what should have been a fairy tale wedding. Richard looked around the room one final time, his eyes landing on Melissa. For a moment, I thought I saw something like remorse flicker across his face. "Melissa," he said quietly, his voice stripped of all its practiced charm. "I never meant for it to go this far." My daughter looked at him with eyes that had been forced to grow up in a matter of minutes. "Yes, you did," she said simply. "This was always the plan." The sound of sirens began to echo in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. Richard slumped against the wall, his perfect posture finally breaking. The man who had swept my daughter off her feet, who had charmed an entire community, who had seemed too good to be true, was finally revealed for exactly what he was. A predator whose hunting season had just ended. Outside, the sirens grew louder. 3 weeks later, I sat in Detective Morrison's office, no relation to Catherine Morrison, though the irony wasn't lost on any of us, listening to the full scope of Richard's crimes. "We've connected him to at least 5 other victims across 3 states, the detective explained, spreading photographs across his desk. "Atlanta, Savannah, Jacksonville, Nashville, and now Charleston. Same pattern every time. Target recently divorced women with assets, gain their trust, drain their accounts, disappear." The photographs showed women who looked heartbreakingly similar to Melissa. Kind faces, trusting eyes, the slightly vulnerable expression of someone who'd been hurt before but was willing to love again. "He's good at what he does," Detective Morrison continued. "Professional-grade fake documents, carefully constructed identities, even references from previous business associates who were actually accomplices. Your daughter wasn't naive, Mrs. Johnson. She was targeted by someone very skilled at this type of fraud. That knowledge helped, but it didn't erase the damage. Melissa had lost nearly everything: her savings, Daniel's college fund, her faith in her own judgment. She'd moved back in with me temporarily, sleeping in her childhood bedroom while lawyers worked to recover what they could of her stolen money. The legal process was slow but thorough. Richard, whose real name turned out to be Marcus Webb, was facing charges in multiple states. Catherine Morrison, his actual wife and partner in crime, had been arrested trying to board a flight to Mexico with several suitcases full of cash. The good news, Detective Morrison said, is that we froze their accounts before they could transfer most of the recent thefts. Your daughter should recover about 60% of what she lost. 60%. Better than nothing, but still a devastating blow for a single mother who'd worked years to build financial security. What about the other victims? I asked. They'll get some restitution too, though the earlier thefts will be harder to recover. The money gets laundered pretty quickly in these operations. I thought about those women in the photographs, wondering how many had family members who tried to warn them, how many had ignored red flags because they wanted so desperately to believe in love again. When I left the police station, I found Melissa and Daniel in the park across the street, sitting on a bench watching other children play. My daughter looked older somehow, harder, but also more grounded than she had in months. How are you holding up, sweetheart? I asked, settling beside her. I'm angry, she said simply. But I'm also relieved. Does that make sense? It made perfect sense. 6 months later, Daniel and I were baking chocolate chip cookies in my kitchen, our weekly tradition that had resumed after the chaos settled. Melissa was at work, slowly rebuilding her life and her confidence, but she was getting stronger every day. Grandma, Daniel said, carefully placing cookie dough on the baking sheet, do you think Mommy will ever get married again? It was a question I'd been expecting, though it still made my heart ache. I don't know, sweetheart, I said honestly. But if she does, it'll be to someone who deserves her. Someone who sees how special she is. Someone who doesn't lie, Daniel added with the straightforward logic of an 8-year-old. Especially someone who doesn't lie. We worked in comfortable silence for a few minutes before Daniel looked up at me with those wise brown eyes. Grandma, I was scared that day. At the wedding. When I saw that envelope. I know you were, baby. But you did the right thing by telling me. I didn't understand what was in it, but I knew it was bad. It felt like when there's a storm coming, you can't see it yet, but you know it's there. His words gave me chills. Children's instincts are often clearer than adults, unclouded by the desire to see what we want to see instead of what's really there. You saved your mommy, I told him, pulling him into a hug. Your courage saved our whole family. As we slid the cookies into the oven, I reflected on everything we'd learned. Richard, Marcus, whatever his name was, had taught us that danger doesn't always come with obvious warning signs. Sometimes it walks into church wearing an expensive suit and a charming smile. Sometimes it sweeps you off your feet with grand gestures and perfect words. But there are always signs, if you're willing to see them. A 7-year-old's unease. A sister's skepticism. A mother's protective instincts. The weight of truth hidden in shadows, waiting to be discovered. Sometimes danger sits smiling at your table, I told Daniel as we waited for the cookies to bake. But courage, sometimes from the smallest voice, saves us all. Daniel nodded solemnly, understanding more than most adults would about the complexities of trust and betrayal. The timer buzzed, and we pulled golden cookies from the oven, filling the kitchen with the warm smell of home and safety and family that endures.